The battle begins. Grace Thompson walked through the sliding glass doors of Riverside General Hospital, her polished black shoes clicking softly against the pristine white tiles. The scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of monitors and distant murmurs of conversation. Her nurse's uniform was freshly pressed, and her name badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. But despite her professional appearance, Grace carried a heavy weight on her shoulders. It wasn't the long hours or the emotional toll of nursing that burdened her. It was the relentless harassment from Dr. Stephen Warner, a senior physician who seemed to take perverse pleasure in undermining her. From subtle digs to outright insults, his disdain for Grace was no secret. And it wasn't just her skills he questioned. It was her very presence. Grace greeted her colleague, Maria, with a warm smile as she reached the nurse's station. Maria, a seasoned nurse with a kind heart, returned the gesture. "Morning, Grace," Maria said, her voice light but laced with concern. "Ready for another day?" "Always," Grace replied with practiced cheerfulness. But her grip on her clipboard tightened as she spotted Dr. Warner approaching. His tall frame cut an imposing figure, his white coat billowing slightly as he walked. His cold blue eyes locked onto her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Nurse Thompson," he said, his tone clipped. "I trust you've managed to organize the patient charts correctly this time, or is that too much to expect?" Grace straightened her posture, refusing to let him see the hurt his words caused. "Everything is in order, Dr. Warner," she replied evenly, handing him the neatly arranged charts. He snatched them from her hand, barely glancing at her. "It had better be," he muttered. "This hospital doesn't need more incompetence." Grace felt a flush of anger rise in her chest, but quickly suppressed it. She had learned long ago that reacting only fueled his cruelty. Instead, she focused on her patients. They were why she endured. Their lives, their stories, their healing. It all mattered more than the venom Dr. Warner spewed. As the day progressed, Grace found herself assisting Dr. Warner during his rounds. She walked a step behind him, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes as he examined each patient. His words were efficient but devoid of empathy, a sharp contrast to Grace's gentle bedside manner. At one point, he turned to her and sneered, "Nurse Thompson, do try to keep up. I understand multitasking might be challenging for you." Her cheeks burned, but she didn't look up. The interns trailing behind him exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to intervene. Grace focused on her writing, her fingers gripping the pen so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The humiliation continued throughout the rounds. Dr. Warner interrupted her repeatedly, dismissing her input and questioning her every move. At one point, he even addressed the interns directly, saying, "This is a prime example of why standards are so important. Not everyone is cut out for this field." Grace's heart clenched at his words, but she refused to let the tears gathering in her eyes fall. Instead, she focused on the patients, offering them a kind smile whenever she could. By midday, Grace was in the ICU, assisting a young mother who had recently undergone surgery. The woman's face was pale, her eyes filled with worry as she clutched her husband's hand. "Don't worry," Grace said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "You're doing great. Just focus on resting, and we'll take care of the rest." The woman smiled weakly, her grip on her husband's hand loosening slightly as Grace adjusted her IV and checked her vitals. It was moments like this that reminded Grace why she had chosen this career. To heal, to comfort, to make a difference. But her brief reprieve was shattered when Dr. Warner stormed into the room. His face was a mask of irritation, his voice sharp as he barked, "Nurse Thompson, I thought I made it clear that these reports were to be finalized by now." "I'm almost done, Doctor," Grace replied, her tone measured. "Almost isn't good enough," he snapped. "Do I need to remind you of the importance of timeliness, or should I start looking for someone more competent?" The patient and her husband exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Grace felt her face flush, but she forced herself to remain calm. She finished her task quickly, her hand steady despite the storm brewing inside her. After Dr. Warner left, the young mother looked up at Grace with sympathy. "I'm so sorry you have to deal with that," she said softly. Grace managed a small smile. "It's okay," she replied. "Let's focus on getting you better." By the time her shift ended, Grace felt drained. The weight of Dr. Warner's insults lingered, a dark cloud over her otherwise fulfilling day. As she drove home, she replayed his words in her mind, the sting of his contempt cutting deeper with each memory. Her modest apartment greeted her with silence. The walls, adorned with framed photos of her family, provided a comforting reminder of the love and support waiting for her. She sank onto her couch, her body heavy with exhaustion, and let out a long, weary sigh. Grace knew she couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. But what could she do? Speaking up felt impossible. Dr. Warner's position of authority ensured that any complaint would likely fall on deaf ears. And yet, the thought of enduring another day of his cruelty made her stomach churn. As the evening stretched on, Grace found herself staring out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Her mind raced with thoughts of her parents, who had always taught her to stand tall in the face of adversity. Their words echoed in her heart, a steady reminder of the resilience she had inherited. "You are more than their judgment," her mother used to say. "Your worth isn't defined by their small minds." Grace clenched her fists, a flicker of determination igniting within her. She didn't have a plan yet, but one thing was certain. She would not let Dr. Warner's hatred break her. A crisis unfolds. The next day, Grace arrived at Riverside General with a sense of renewed determination. Her mother's words from the night before rang in her ears like a mantra. "Your worth isn't defined by their small minds." She squared her shoulders, silently promising herself to stay strong. The morning began like any other. The bustling hospital corridors teemed with activity as nurses and doctors moved with practiced efficiency. Grace quickly checked the schedule and noted her assignments. Today, she was in charge of several critical cases in the ICU, a responsibility she welcomed. Caring for patients who needed her the most gave her purpose, even in the face of adversity. As she started her rounds, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering in the back of her mind. The tension between her and Dr. Warner had reached a breaking point yesterday. She knew it was only a matter of time before he found another opportunity to undermine her. Her thoughts were interrupted when the intercom crackled to life. "Code Blue, room 315. Code Blue, room 315. Grace's heart jumped. A code blue meant a medical emergency, usually cardiac or respiratory arrest. She grabbed the nearest crash cart and sprinted toward the room. Adrenaline coursed through her veins as she reached the doorway, where a crowd of staff was already gathering. Inside the room, an elderly man lay motionless, his face ashen. The monitor displayed a flatline, the unmistakable sign of cardiac arrest. Grace quickly assessed the scene and sprang into action. "Start compressions," she ordered, her voice steady and authoritative. A young nurse stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she began chest compressions. Grace worked swiftly, preparing the defibrillator and ensuring the patient's airway was clear. Dr. Warner burst into the room moments later, his face a mask of irritation rather than urgency. "What's going on here?" he barked, his eyes darting around the room. "Cardiac arrest," Grace replied without looking up. "We've started compressions, and I'm charging the defibrillator." Dr. Warner's lips pressed into a thin line as he crossed his arms. "Step aside, Nurse Thompson. I'll handle this." Grace hesitated for a fraction of a second. The patient's life hung in the balance, and she knew every second counted. Reluctantly, she stepped back, but not before ensuring the defibrillator was ready. Dr. Warner took over, his movements rushed and disorganized. His first attempt to deliver a shock was delayed because he hadn't checked the patient's connection to the machine. Grace watched, her stomach twisting in knots as precious seconds ticked away. "Clear," Dr. Warner shouted, finally delivering the shock. The patient's body jerked, but the monitor remained flat. "Resume compressions," Grace said, stepping forward instinctively. The young nurse resumed CPR, her face pale with effort. Dr. Warner glared at Grace. "I don't need your commentary," he snapped. Grace bit back a retort, focusing instead on the patient. She could see the cracks in Dr. Warner's confidence, his usual arrogance faltering under the weight of the crisis. Despite his attempts to maintain control, it was clear that he was in over his head. The tension in the room was palpable as another round of defibrillation failed to restore a heartbeat. Grace's mind raced as she calculated their options. She knew the patient's chances were slipping away with every passing moment. "Doctor," she said cautiously, "we should consider administering epinephrine. His condition suggests." "I didn't ask for your opinion," Dr. Warner interrupted, his voice sharp. "Do your job and let me do mine." Grace's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. Arguing wouldn't help the patient. Instead, she turned her attention to the crash cart, discreetly preparing the medication she knew the patient needed. As the minutes dragged on, the room grew heavy with unspoken doubt. The other staff members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence in Dr. Warner waning. Grace could feel the weight of their collective hesitation, their silent plea for someone to take charge. Finally, when it became clear that Dr. Warner's approach was failing, Grace made a decision. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "Doctor, with respect, we're running out of time. We need to administer epinephrine now." Dr. Warner's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, one of the interns spoke up. "She's right, doctor. It's standard protocol in cases like this." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Dr. Warner. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed he might refuse out of sheer pride. But then he gave a curt nod. "Fine. Do it." Grace moved quickly, injecting the medication into the patient's IV. She monitored the patient closely, her heart pounding as they resumed compressions. "Charge to 200, Grace said, her voice steady. The defibrillator whirred to life as she prepared for another shock. "Clear." The patient's body jolted, and this time, a faint but steady rhythm appeared on the monitor. Relief washed over the room as the staff let out a collective sigh. The color slowly returned to the patient's face, and his breathing stabilized. Grace stepped back, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. She glanced at Dr. Warner, who was staring at the monitor with a conflicted expression. For the first time, his usual smug confidence was absent, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Good work," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Then he turned and left the room without another word. The silence that followed was broken by the young nurse who had performed compressions. "You saved him," she said, her voice filled with awe. Grace shook her head. "We all did. It was a team effort." But as she left the room, she couldn't ignore the shift in the atmosphere. The other staff members looked at her with newfound respect, their expressions no longer clouded by pity or hesitation. For the first time, Grace felt truly seen, not as a target for Dr. Warner's scorn, but as a capable and compassionate professional. As the day went on, Grace couldn't shake the memory of Dr. Warner's reaction. His anger had been palpable, but so had his reluctance to confront the truth. She wondered if this moment might be the beginning of a change, or if his pride would only harden further. Grace didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She would continue to stand tall. No matter how many times Dr. Warner tried to tear her down, she would rise. Because for Grace, it was never about proving him wrong. It was about staying true to herself and the values that had guided her through every challenge. And today, those values had made all the difference. As the adrenaline from the code blue began to wear off, Grace found herself retreating to the staff break room for a moment of quiet. The small, brightly lit space was mostly empty, save for a young intern pouring himself a cup of coffee. Grace sat down at the corner table, her hand still trembling slightly. The events of the last hour replayed in her mind, Dr. Warner's stubbornness, the mounting tension, and the relief of finally saving the patient. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment to steady herself. The crisis had tested her limits, but it had also reminded her why she loved her work. It wasn't about the recognition or proving herself to anyone. It was about the patients. The door swung open, and Maria walked in, her face lit with a warm smile. "There you are," she said, grabbing a chair and sitting across from Grace. "I heard what happened in room 315. Word travels fast around here." Grace raised an eyebrow, sipping her water. "And what exactly did you hear?" Maria leaned forward conspiratorially. "That you practically took over the code blue and saved the patient. People are talking." Grace frowned. "It wasn't like that. I just did what needed to be done." Maria tilted her head, studying her friend. "Don't downplay it. I've worked with Dr. Warner for years, and I'd never seen anyone stand up to him like that, especially in a life-or-death situation." Grace sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean to undermine him, but he was letting his pride get in the way, and the patient was running out of time. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." Maria reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's arm. "You did the right thing, and people noticed. Even the interns are saying they've never seen anything like it." Grace shook her head, feeling a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and unease. "I don't want this to turn into something bigger. I just want to do my job." Maria smiled gently. "I get that. But Grace, you've already proven you're more than capable. Don't let anyone, especially someone like Dr. Warner, make you feel otherwise." The break room door opened again, and this time it was one of the interns who had been present during the code blue. A young man with dark hair and glasses. He looked hesitant as he approached their table. "Excuse me, Nurse Thompson," he said, his voice slightly nervous. "I just wanted to say, you were incredible in there. The way you stayed calm and took charge, it was inspiring." Grace felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Thank you, but really, it was a team effort." The intern shook his head. "No, it wasn't just that. You showed us what real leadership looks like. I learned more from you in that one crisis than I have in weeks of shadowing Dr. Warner." Maria shot Grace a knowing look as the intern walked away, leaving her speechless. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the intercom buzzed again, this time announcing another emergency, this one a fire drill. Maria stood, chuckling. No rest for the wicked. "Come on, hero. Let's get moving." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Grace buried herself in her work, tending to patients and coordinating care with her usual diligence. She did her best to avoid Dr. Warner, but their paths inevitably crossed late in the afternoon during a meeting with the ICU staff. The meeting room was small, with a rectangular table surrounded by chairs. Grace took a seat near the middle, hoping to blend into the background. Dr. Warner entered moments later, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He glanced briefly in Grace's direction, but said nothing. The meeting began with the usual updates and discussions about patient care. Grace listened attentively, contributing when necessary but otherwise keeping a low profile. However, as the meeting progressed, she couldn't help but notice Dr. Warner's unusually subdued demeanor. He seemed distracted, his usual sharp comments replaced with curt nods and brief answers. When the topic of the code blue in room 315 came up, the department head turned to Dr. Warner. "Excellent outcome in that case. Well done to everyone involved. Dr. Warner, I heard Nurse Thompson played a key role. Would you like to elaborate?" All eyes turned to Dr. Warner, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Grace felt her heart rate quicken, unsure of what he might say. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "The patient's recovery was a collective effort," he said, his tone measured. Nurse Thompson's quick thinking was commendable. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Grace blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Was that a compliment? Before she could process it, the department head smiled and nodded. Good to hear. It's important to recognize teamwork in situations like these. The meeting continued, but Grace barely registered the conversation. Dr. Warner's acknowledgement, however grudging, felt like a small victory. It wasn't an apology, and it didn't erase the months of humiliation she had endured. But it was something. A crack in his armor. Later that evening, as Grace walked to her car in the dimly lit parking lot, she replayed the day's events in her mind. The crisis, the intern's praise, Dr. Warner's reluctant compliment, it all felt surreal. For so long, she had struggled to prove herself in the face of his prejudice, and now, for the first time, she felt like she had made an impact. But Grace knew this wasn't the end. Dr. Warner's grudging words were a small step, not a resolution. There was still a long road ahead, and she would need to stay strong. As she unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, she felt a flicker of hope. Today, she had shown her true strength, not just to Dr. Warner or her colleagues, but to herself. And that, she realized, was the most important victory of all. The unraveling truth. The next morning, Grace arrived at the hospital with a sense of cautious optimism. The events of the previous day still lingered in her mind, from the chaotic code blue to the hesitant acknowledgement from Dr. Warner. It wasn't much, but it felt like a glimmer of progress. She pushed through the revolving doors, her nurse's uniform crisp and her chin held high. As she approached the nurse's station, Maria was already there, tapping on the keyboard while glancing at the morning schedule. She greeted Grace with a knowing smile. "Morning, Grace. You're already a bit of a legend, you know," Maria teased, nudging her gently. Grace shook her head with a faint smile. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. One moment doesn't change everything." Maria leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Maybe not, but I heard something interesting this morning. Dr. Warner had a private meeting with the chief of staff after yesterday's incident. Word is, they're keeping an eye on him." Grace's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Maria shrugged, her expression serious now. "Apparently, a few interns have been speaking up about his behavior, not just toward you, but in general. You might not be the only one who's had enough." The thought left Grace conflicted. On one hand, it was a relief to know she wasn't alone in feeling mistreated. On the other, the idea of being at the center of such scrutiny made her stomach churn. She didn't want to be seen as a troublemaker or someone who caused division. All she wanted was to do her job in peace. As the day unfolded, Grace focused on her work, pushing the conversation with Maria to the back of her mind. She spent the morning in the pediatric ward, where her natural warmth and patience shone through. Children were often wary of hospitals, but Grace had a knack for putting them at ease with her gentle demeanor and infectious smile. By midday, she was back in the ICU, assisting with a particularly challenging case involving a young man recovering from a motorcycle accident. His injuries were extensive, and his recovery would be long and arduous. Grace worked alongside the surgical team, carefully monitoring his vitals and coordinating his post-operative care. Dr. Warner entered the room mid-shift, his expression as stern as ever. Grace tensed instinctively, but forced herself to remain composed. She continued her work, answering his questions with precision and professionalism. To her surprise, Dr. Warner's usual bards were absent. He addressed her with a curt but civil tone, focusing on the patient rather than his usual commentary on her supposed shortcomings. Grace couldn't decide if his change in demeanor was genuine or calculated, but she wasn't about to let her guard down. Later in the afternoon, as Grace finished updating the patient's chart, she overheard two interns talking in hushed tones near the nurse's station. Their conversation caught her attention. "Did you hear about Dr. Warner?" One of them whispered. "Apparently, the chief is looking into some complaints, something about him crossing the line with staff." The other intern nodded. "I heard he's on thin ice. Makes you wonder how he's gotten away with it for so long." Grace's stomach churned. She had endured Dr. Warner's hostility for months, but hearing confirmation that others had also been affected brought a mix of emotions: vindication, frustration, and a lingering sense of unease. As the evening approached, Grace's shift was winding down when a commotion erupted near the emergency department. A series of loud voices and hurried footsteps echoed through the halls, drawing her attention. She followed the noise, her heart racing as she approached the scene. A young woman was being rushed into the ER on a stretcher, her face pale and her breathing shallow. A paramedic rattled off her condition to the attending staff: severe anaphylaxis, likely caused by a food allergy. The woman's face was swollen, her lips blue, and her airway dangerously constricted. Grace instinctively jumped into action, assisting the team as they prepared to intubate the patient. She worked quickly, checking the equipment and ensuring everything was ready. The attending physician, Dr. Patel, issued orders in a calm but urgent tone. "We need epinephrine now," he commanded. Grace handed him the syringe without hesitation, her focus laser-sharp. As the medication was administered, the woman's breathing began to stabilize, though her condition remained critical. Dr. Warner arrived moments later, his face tight with urgency. He assessed the situation quickly and took over, issuing instructions with the authority of someone who had seen countless emergencies. Grace worked alongside him, her movements efficient and precise. For a brief moment, the tension between them seemed to dissolve as they worked toward a common goal. There was no room for egos or grudges in the face of life and death. After what felt like an eternity, the patient's vitals began to improve. The room filled with a collective sigh of relief as the crisis abated. Grace stepped back, wiping the sweat from her brow, and caught Dr. Warner glancing at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was no trace of his usual disdain. "Good work," he said, his tone neutral. Grace nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't sure what had prompted his shift in attitude, but she wasn't about to let her guard down. That evening, as Grace prepared to leave the hospital, she was approached by one of the interns who had been present during the emergency. "Grace," the intern said, her voice hesitant, "I just wanted to say, you were incredible today. Honestly, watching you work, it was inspiring." Grace smiled, though she felt a pang of self-consciousness. "Thank you. I'm just doing my job." The intern shook her head. "No, it's more than that. You're calm under pressure, and you really care about the patients. People notice that even if they don't always say it." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. The intern's words were a stark contrast to the relentless criticism she had grown accustomed to. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not just for her skills, but for her humanity. As she walked to her car, the events of the day replayed in her mind. The subtle shift in Dr. Warner's behavior, the whispers about complaints, the young intern's praise. It all felt like the beginning of something bigger. Change was on the horizon, and though she didn't know what form it would take, Grace felt ready to face it. She sat in her car for a moment before driving home, staring at the hospital's glowing facade. Riverside General had been a place of both triumph and pain for her, but tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like a place where she could truly make a difference, not just for her patients, but for herself. The road ahead would be difficult, but Grace had never been one to back down from a challenge. She gripped the steering wheel, her resolve hardening. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on, with courage, with compassion, and with the unshakable belief that she deserved to be here. The spark of resistance. Grace entered the hospital the next day feeling an unusual mix of apprehension and determination. Something had shifted, subtly but undeniably. The whispers among the interns, the brief acknowledgement from Dr. Warner, and her own growing confidence. It was as though the tide was beginning to turn. Yet, with change often came resistance, and Grace knew the path forward would not be without obstacles. As she made her way to the nurses' station, her attention was drawn to a cluster of staff huddled near the break room. Their murmurs filled the air with an undercurrent of tension. Grace caught snippets of their conversation. Dr. Warner's name was mentioned more than once, along with words like investigation and formal complaint. Maria spotted Grace and broke away from the group, her expression serious. "Grace, have you heard?" Grace shook her head. "What's going on?" Maria glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "It's official. A formal investigation has been launched into Dr. Warner's conduct. A few staff members came forward after yesterday's emergency. I think your role in the Code Blue might have been the final push." Grace's stomach tightened. "The final push. I didn't file a complaint." Maria nodded. "I know. But people noticed how you handled yourself yesterday, how you stayed calm and took charge when he hesitated. And they've noticed how he's treated you. It's like a spotlight has been turned on him." Grace leaned against the counter, trying to process the information. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief that Dr. Warner's behavior was finally being addressed, but also anxiety about being thrust into the center of such a storm. She had never sought confrontation, but now it seemed unavoidable. Before Grace could respond, the intercom crackled to life, summoning her to a meeting in the Chief of Staff's office. Her heart sank. She nodded at Maria and made her way down the sterile corridors, her mind racing. The Chief of Staff's office was a stark contrast to the bustling hospital floors. It was quiet and orderly, with dark wooden furniture and a large window overlooking the city. Dr. Patel, the Chief of Staff, sat behind his desk, his expression calm but serious. "Grace," he said as she entered, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Grace sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You wanted to see me?" Dr. Patel nodded. "Yes. I'm sure you've heard by now that there's been an investigation launched into Dr. Warner's conduct. I want to assure you that this is not about assigning blame or causing division. It's about ensuring that Riverside General remains a safe and supportive environment for all of our staff." Grace swallowed hard. "I understand. I've reviewed the reports from yesterday's emergency," Dr. Patel continued. "Your actions during the Code Blue were exemplary. You demonstrated exceptional leadership under pressure. But I also noticed that several staff members mentioned the ongoing tension between you and Dr. Warner. Grace, I want to give you the opportunity to share your experience." Grace hesitated. She had spent months enduring Dr. Warner's hostility in silence, fearing that speaking up would only make things worse. But now, sitting in front of Dr. Patel, she realized that this was her chance to be heard. "It hasn't been easy," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion welling in her chest. "Dr. Warner has made it clear from the beginning that he doesn't think I belong here. He's questioned my competence, belittled me in front of colleagues, and dismissed my input, even when patients' lives were at stake." Dr. Patel's expression darkened. "I'm sorry you've had to endure that, Grace. No one should have to work under those conditions." Grace nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders as she continued. "I've tried to rise above it. I've focused on my patients and my work because that's what matters to me. But it's hard. It's hard to give your best when you're constantly being undermined." Dr. Patel leaned forward, his tone resolute. "Your professionalism and dedication are evident, Grace, and I want you to know that we take these matters very seriously. We will be conducting a thorough investigation, and steps will be taken to address this situation." Grace felt a mix of relief and apprehension. "Thank you, Dr. Patel. I appreciate that." As the meeting concluded, Grace left the office with a sense of cautious optimism. She didn't know what the outcome of the investigation would be, but for the first time, she felt like her voice had been heard. Back on the floor, Grace returned to her duties, focusing on her patients with renewed determination. She knew that her work spoke louder than any words, and she was determined to let her actions define her. But as the day progressed, she couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension in the hospital. The news of the investigation had spread, and the atmosphere was charged with uncertainty. Some staff members avoided Dr. Warner entirely, while others whispered behind closed doors. Grace's interactions with Dr. Warner were minimal, but when they did cross paths, his demeanor was icy. She could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, though he refrained from his usual comments. It was clear that he was aware of the investigation, and his pride had taken a hit. Later that evening, Grace found herself back in the break room, seeking a moment of solitude. She sipped her tea, staring out the window at the city lights. The events of the day had left her emotionally drained, but she also felt a quiet strength building within her. Maria entered the room, her expression soft as she sat down beside Grace. "How are you holding up?" Grace smiled faintly. "Better than I expected." "It's been a lot." Maria nodded. "I can imagine. But Grace, you're doing something important. By standing up, you're making it better for all of us." Grace glanced at her friend, her eyes glistening. "I didn't set out to make waves. I just wanted to do my job." "And you've done it better than anyone," Maria said firmly. "That's why people are standing with you. You've inspired them." Grace took a deep breath, letting Maria's words sink in. She hadn't seen herself as an inspiration, just a nurse trying to make it through each day. But maybe in her quiet resilience, she had sparked something bigger. As she finished her tea and prepared to leave, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was no longer walking it alone. Together, they would bring light to the shadows and create a better, stronger Riverside General for everyone. Grace left the break room with Maria's words still echoing in her mind. "You've inspired them." It was a strange feeling to think of herself as a source of inspiration, especially when she still felt the sting of Dr. Warner's scorn lingering in her heart. But as she walked down the hospital corridors, her steps felt a little lighter, her shoulders a little straighter. For the first time in months, she felt like she wasn't alone. She returned to the ICU to check on her patients. The evening shift was quieter, with fewer emergencies and a calmer energy throughout the ward. Grace moved from room to room, her focus on the individuals under her care. She spoke softly to an elderly woman recovering from surgery, adjusted the IV drip of a teenager who had been in a car accident, and offered a reassuring smile to a nervous father pacing outside his child's room. In moments like these, Grace found her strength. She knew that her role extended far beyond the technical tasks of nursing. It was about being a presence of calm, compassion, and humanity in a place often filled with fear and uncertainty. Just as Grace was finishing her rounds, she received a call to assist with a patient being transferred from the ER. The patient was a young woman in her early 20s who had suffered a severe asthma attack. Her condition had stabilized, but she required close monitoring in the ICU. When the patient arrived, Grace took charge of settling her in. She worked efficiently, checking the oxygen levels, adjusting the ventilator settings, and ensuring the young woman was comfortable. As she documented the patient's condition, she noticed Dr. Warner entering the room. His face was unreadable, but his presence immediately brought a wave of tension. Grace focused on her tasks, refusing to let his presence rattle her. She handed him the chart, her voice steady. "The patient's vitals are stable, but her oxygen levels are still fluctuating slightly. I recommend continuous monitoring overnight." Dr. Warner glanced at the chart, his lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, he said nothing, and Grace braced herself for the sharp critique she had come to expect. But instead, he nodded curtly. "Agreed," he said, his tone neutral. "Make sure she's prioritized for the night shift." Grace blinked, caught off guard by his response. "Of course, doctor," she replied, her voice even. As Dr. Warner left the room, Grace felt a mix of emotions. His civility was unexpected, almost unsettling. Was it a sign that he was changing, or was he simply being cautious because of the investigation? Either way, Grace knew better than to let her guard down. Later that evening, Grace returned to the nurse's station to update her notes. She noticed a few of her colleagues gathered nearby, their expressions serious. Maria was among them, and she waved Grace over. "What's going on?" Grace asked, setting down her clipboard. Maria lowered her voice. "One of the interns found out that Dr. Warner is meeting with the hospital board tomorrow. They're reviewing the complaints and deciding on the next steps." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Already? That's fast. Maria nodded. Apparently, the chief of staff wants to address this quickly. They've interviewed several staff members, including some of the interns who've worked under him. From what I've heard, it's not looking good for Dr. Warner. Grace felt a swirl of emotions, relief, anxiety, and even a twinge of guilt. Despite everything he had put her through, the idea of someone's career being jeopardized was sobering. But then she thought of the countless moments of humiliation and the patients whose care had been compromised by his arrogance. The investigation wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. I just hope this leads to real change, Grace said quietly. Maria placed a reassuring hand on her arm. It will. One way or another, things are changing. As Grace drove home that night, her mind was filled with questions. What would happen to Dr. Warner? Would the board take action? And if they did, would it truly make a difference in the hospital's culture? She thought about the young interns who had found the courage to speak up, about the quiet solidarity she had begun to feel among her colleagues. Change was in the air, but it felt fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter it. When she arrived home, Grace was greeted by the comforting aroma of her mother's cooking. Her parents were already seated at the kitchen table, their faces lighting up as she walked in. "There's our hero," her father said with a grin, pulling out a chair for her. Grace smiled, sinking into the seat. It's been a long day. Her mother placed a plate of steaming food in front of her. "Tell us about it, sweetheart." As Grace recounted the events of the day, the investigation, the patient emergencies, and Dr. Warner's uncharacteristic behavior, her parents listened intently. Her father nodded thoughtfully, while her mother's eyes glistened with pride. "You're making a difference, Grace," her father said. "Not just for your patients, but for your coworkers too." Grace hesitated, her fork poised over her plate. "I don't know if I'm doing enough. Sometimes it feels like the system is too big to change." Her mother reached across the table, taking her hand. "Change doesn't happen all at once, Gracie. It starts with people like you, people who have the courage to stand up and do what's right, even when it's hard." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. Her parents' unwavering support had always been her anchor, and tonight was no different. As she ate her dinner and listened to their stories of resilience and perseverance, she felt her resolve strengthen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Grace was ready to face them. The spark of resistance had been lit, and she was determined to see it through. No matter what happened with Dr. Warner or the investigation, she would continue to fight for what was right, for herself, for her patients, and for the future of Riverside General. A reckoning at Riverside. The next morning, Grace walked into the hospital with a sense of anticipation buzzing in the air. News of Dr. Warner's meeting with the board had spread quickly, and the usual hum of hospital activity was accompanied by whispers and sidelong glances. Grace could feel the tension even before she reached the nurse's station. Maria was already there, sipping her coffee and scanning patient charts. She looked up as Grace approached and gave her a conspiratorial smile. "Big day," Maria said, her voice low. "The board's meeting started an hour ago. Apparently, they've called in some of the staff for additional testimony." Grace felt a flutter of nerves. "Do you know who?" Maria nodded. "A couple of the interns, a few nurses, and—" She hesitated, her eyes locking onto Grace's. "They might call you too." Grace's stomach churned. She had been preparing herself for this possibility, but the thought of sitting in front of the board and recounting her experiences was daunting. Still, she knew she couldn't back down now, not when so much was at stake. "I'll be ready," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. Maria smiled warmly. "I know you will." Grace spent the morning immersed in her duties, focusing on her patients to keep her mind from spiraling. She worked with a quiet intensity, checking vitals, administering medications, and comforting worried families. Each interaction reminded her why she had chosen this profession. It wasn't about proving herself to Dr. Warner or anyone else. It was about making a difference. Just before noon, The call came. A nurse from the administrative office appeared at the ICU door, her expression unreadable. "Nurse Thompson," she said, "the board would like to speak with you." Grace nodded, her heart pounding as she set down her clipboard. Maria gave her an encouraging squeeze on the shoulder as she passed by, and Grace took a deep breath to steady herself. The walk to the conference room felt longer than it should have. When she arrived, the heavy wooden door loomed in front of her like a barrier to another world. She hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the atmosphere was solemn. A long table dominated the room, surrounded by members of the hospital's board, including Dr. Puddle. Dr. Warner sat at one end, his expression cold and impassive. Grace's gaze flicked to him briefly before she focused on Dr. Patel, who gestured for her to take a seat. "Thank you for joining us, Nurse Thompson," Dr. Patel said. His tone was calm but authoritative. "We've asked you here to provide your perspective on some of the issues that have been raised. Please speak freely. This is a safe space." Grace nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She took a moment to gather her thoughts before beginning. "I've worked at Riverside General for 2 years," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "In that time, I've always tried to focus on my patients and provide the best care possible. But over the past several months, I've experienced significant challenges working under Dr. Warner." She glanced briefly at Dr. Warner, whose expression remained stony, before continuing. "Dr. Warner has repeatedly questioned my competence, dismissed my input, and belittled me in front of colleagues. His comments have often been personal and demeaning, and they've created an environment that's difficult to work in." The board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Dr. Patel nodded, encouraging her to go on. "Despite these challenges, I've tried to rise above it," Grace said. "I've focused on my patients and done everything I can to support my team. But there have been moments when his behavior has directly impacted patient care. Yesterday's Code Blue is a prime example." Dr. Warner hesitated, and the patient's life was at risk. "I had to step in to ensure the appropriate action was taken." Dr. Patel's brow furrowed. "That's a serious allegation, Nurse Thompson. Can you elaborate on what happened?" Grace recounted the events of the Code Blue, her voice steady as she described the tension in the room, Dr. Warner's hesitation, and her decision to administer the necessary medication. She spoke with clarity, avoiding exaggeration or speculation, and focused solely on the facts. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then one of the board members leaned forward. "Nurse Thompson," he said, his tone measured, "do you believe Dr. Warner's behavior is indicative of a broader issue within the hospital?" Grace hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think Dr. Warner's behavior is an extreme example, but it reflects a culture that can sometimes prioritize hierarchy over teamwork. When staff members feel unsupported or dismissed, it affects not only them, but also the quality of care we provide." Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Grace. Your insights are invaluable." As the meeting continued, Grace answered additional questions about her experiences and offered suggestions for improving the hospital's culture. She spoke with a quiet confidence, drawing strength from her conviction that change was necessary. When the board finally dismissed her, Grace stood and left the room, her heart pounding. She had spoken her truth, and now it was out of her hands. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Grace returned to her duties, trying to focus on her patients, but her mind kept drifting back to the meeting. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the board take action against Dr. Warner? And if they did, what would it mean for her? That evening, as the hospital began to quiet down, Grace found herself in the break room once again. Maria joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "You did it," Maria said with a smile. "You stood up for yourself." Grace sighed, cradling the warm cup in her hands. "I just hope it makes a difference." Maria nodded. "It will. Maybe not right away, but you've started something. And that's more than most people ever do." As Grace sat there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the hospital, She felt a sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had done her part. For herself, for her colleagues, and for every patient who walked through Riverside General's doors. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight, Grace allowed herself to rest. She had faced her fears and stood tall in the face of injustice. And no matter what happened next, she knew she had the strength to keep moving forward. A new dawn. The following morning, Grace walked into Riverside General Hospital with her heart pounding in her chest. Today, the board would announce their decision regarding Dr. Warner. The weight of the investigation, the testimonies, and the tension in the hospital corridors felt almost unbearable. But beneath her nerves, Grace felt a spark of hope. Whatever the outcome, she knew she had stood up not only for herself, but for the values that defined her work. The hospital was unusually quiet for a weekday morning. Grace noticed small clusters of staff whispering in corners, their faces tight with anticipation. As she approached the nurse's station, Maria was already waiting for her, her expression a mix of excitement and nervous energy. "Today's the day," Maria said, handing Grace her patient list. "They're making the announcement at noon." Grace nodded, her throat tight. "Do you think they'll take action?" Maria shrugged. "I don't see how they can't. Too many people have come forward, and the evidence is overwhelming. But whatever happens, Grace, you've already made a difference. Don't forget that." Grace managed a small smile. Maria's words were comforting, but the uncertainty still gnawed at her. She took a deep breath and threw herself into her morning rounds, focusing on her patients to keep her mind occupied. By the time noon arrived, the hospital was buzzing with anticipation. Staff members gathered in the cafeteria, where the chief of staff, Dr. Patel, was scheduled to make the announcement. Grace joined Maria and a few other nurses at a table near the back, her palms damp as she clutched her coffee cup. The room fell silent as Dr. Patel stepped onto the small platform at the front of the room. His expression was serious, his hands clasped in front of him. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady. "Thank you all for taking the time to be here today. Over the past week, we've conducted a thorough investigation into allegations of misconduct by Dr. Stephen Warner. We've reviewed testimony from staff members, interns, and patients, and we've considered the impact of these allegations on the hospital's culture and patient care." Grace's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she waited for the verdict. After careful deliberation, Dr. Patel continued, "The board has decided to terminate Dr. Warner's employment at Riverside General Hospital, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a flurry of murmurs. Grace felt a wave of emotion wash over her, relief, vindication, and a strange sense of finality. She glanced at Maria, who gave her a triumphant smile. Dr. Patel held up his hand to quiet the crowd. This decision was not made lightly. Dr. Warner has been a skilled physician in many respects, but his behavior toward his colleagues has been unacceptable and inconsistent with the values of this institution. We are committed to fostering an environment of respect, collaboration, and inclusivity moving forward. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. To that end, we will be implementing new training programs and support systems to ensure that all staff members feel valued and heard. This is not just about addressing one individual's behavior. It's about creating a culture where everyone can thrive. The room erupted into quiet applause, the tension beginning to lift. Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the significance of what had just happened. It wasn't just about Dr. Warner's dismissal. It was about a shift in the hospital's culture, one that she had played a part in bringing about. After the announcement, Grace returned to her duties, her steps lighter than they had been in months. The atmosphere in the hospital had changed almost instantly. Staff members seemed more relaxed, their smiles genuine rather than forced. Even the interns, who had often been the targets of Dr. Warner's harsh critiques, walked with a newfound confidence. As Grace checked on one of her patients, a young girl recovering from surgery, the child's mother reached out to touch her hand. "You've been so kind," the woman said, her eyes shining with gratitude. I don't know what we would have done without you." Grace smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "It's my pleasure. Your daughter is a fighter. She's going to be just fine." As she left the room, Grace realized how much lighter she felt. For months, she had carried the burden of Dr. Warner's cruelty. But now, that weight was gone. She could focus fully on what mattered most, her patients. That evening, as Grace prepared to leave the hospital, she was approached by Dr. Patel. He was waiting near the main entrance, his hands in his pockets. "Grace," he said, his tone warm, "I wanted to thank you personally for your courage. Your testimony was instrumental in helping the board make their decision." Grace hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I just did what I thought was right," she said finally. Dr. Patel nodded. "And that's exactly what we need more of in this hospital. You've set an example for all of us." Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, Dr. Patel. That means a lot." He smiled. "Keep up the good work, Grace. You're making a difference." As Grace drove home that night, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. The hospital was changing, and she had played a part in that transformation. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time, Grace felt like she truly belonged. When she arrived home, her parents were waiting for her, as they always were. Her mother enveloped her in a warm hug, while her father beamed with pride. "We heard the news," her father said, his voice filled with emotion. "You did it, Grace." Grace smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "We all did. It wasn't just me." Her mother squeezed her hand. "But you were the spark, Gracie. And now look how brightly it's burning." As the evening wore on, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the struggles, the moments of doubt, and the quiet victories that had led to real change. And as she sat with her family, surrounded by their love and support, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.